Hi, to Ask Zajef Yelan edition, and there are many things to say, many things to talk about. So, oh yeah, also, say thank you to Shuffle, Mr. Fluffle, Mr. Kerfuffle, for compiling the questions for us. Thank you. First things first, what is her overall place in the meta, pull value, and how much has changed with her since Dendro's release, if at all? Yelan is very good. I'd say that in Genshin, there's one unit that I would say is arguably a must-have, and that's Xingqiu. The reason why Xingqiu is a must-have is because A, in my opinion, he's the best unit in the game, and B, you can actually guarantee him just from Star Glitter, from the shop, without having to spend a fuck ton of Primo Gems on a banner you don't want to wish on. And that the combination of those two things is why he's one unit that I would consider a must-have. And then you could argue that Bennett is also a must-have because also incredibly good and also available through the shop directly. And any unit other than that, I think that using the word must for is not something I would do, because at the end of the day, people play Genshin for different reasons, and units that you have to spend Primo Gems for, basically no matter how good they are, if you don't like them and you're not gonna play them much, you shouldn't get them. But if I didn't have the same reservations with the word must that I do, there would be a few units that I could potentially consider not must-haves, but units that any player who wants to focus mainly on meta when it comes to wishing should get eventually on their account, because they enable so many options for teams, and they're so versatile, and they're so strong in what they do, that unless you just really don't like them, you're probably not benching them anytime soon. And those units are, for the 5 stars, because the 4 stars generally, like, you don't make the conscious decision to go for them, they just happen eventually, would be Kazuha, Nahida, and Yelan. Those would be the 3. And again, right, it's not that you need those units to have good teams. You can have very good teams without them, but because they're present in so many good teams, because they're so versatile, because they're very strong, having them available is gonna make your account just overall feel stronger. There are also 4-star units that would fit that same level of strength, but because they're not 4-star units, it's not really a question of whether you actively go for them, right? So I'm limiting this only to the 5 stars, but all in all, Yelan is, if you're a player who focuses mainly on meta, is a unit that is worth going for on your account at some point. That being said, if you don't have the primos to go for her now, don't worry. Yelan's gonna be a profitable banner for them, because a lot of people are gonna go for her because it's no secret that she's strong, which means that, well, if they want money, they're gonna rerun her here and there. They're not just gonna hide her rerun away for 3 years. So with that in mind, just remember that you don't need to go for her on this banner. You can get her at another point eventually, which means that if you don't have the primos to guarantee her right now, it's not the end of the world, and you shouldn't feel forced to spend because I said that she's very good. Like, I don't want anyone to ever come out of one of my videos with that impression for any character. No character is worth spending money that you were not planning on spending. But that goes both to her place in the meta and to her pull value. She's just very strong. That being said, I would say that there are definitely misconceptions about her strength, and I forgot. For those on YouTube, I've been streaming for like 9 hours already, so I'm a little bit tired, but we'll power through it. That being said, there are definitely like some misconceptions about how strong she is, and more specifically how she compares to Xingqiu, and how much has changed with her since Dendro's release, if at all. I mean, there's definitely a lot of new teams that can use her. There's a bunch of new reactions, a lot of which use Hydro, so there's definitely new ways to use her. But the core things relating to her overall place in the meta and pull value, I would say, have not really changed. She's still about as good as she was pre-Dendro, like comparatively to other characters. She got stronger with Dendro, but so did a lot of other characters. Although, specifically in her teams where you play her alone as the Hydro unit, so without Xingqiu, she does have a few more options now, because she was somewhat limited in that sense before Dendro, because her Hydro application could sometimes be a bit too slow for a lot of the Pyro carries that wanted an off-field Hydro unit, which could sometimes be a problem. But in Dendro teams, sometimes that's not actually that big of a downside, and we'll get to that. Sometimes it is, though. Sometimes it is. And again, we'll get to that as well. How good is she as a pull over the other 5-star Hydros? What are her strengths and weaknesses compared to them? And is her value affected by a player's willingness to run her in double Hydro? Let's start with that last one. Yes, it is. I'd say that if you don't want to run double Hydro, if you don't want to run Xingqiu, or if you absolutely want to run Xingqiu in a team where you don't have room to slot in Yelan, it makes her definitely quite a bit weaker. However, that doesn't mean that she doesn't still have a lot of options. She still does. It's just that a lot of her strong options get taken away. How good is she as a pull over the other 5-star Hydros? Better, honestly. The main weakness that Yelan has compared to the other 5-star Hydros is that she has no AoE, right? If you look at a unit like Kokomi, she has AoE on her E, not really AoE on her normal attacks, but her E lasts like a long time, especially with burst refresh, which makes it so that you have constant AoE Hydro application, even if it's not like the fastest. You look at Ayato and you look at Child, both of which have very good AoE Hydro application. Yelan doesn't really have a way to do that. She can apply AoE Hydro on her E, and then you don't have any AoE, which would be her main weakness compared to them. However, her strength compared to them is that, well, she does basically all of her stuff without really needing to be on field, which is a massive upside, and she often just also does as much if not more damage, unless you're stacking a lot of buffs on your Hydro unit. That's the basic idea behind those. If you were able to choose 2 of the 5-star Hydros for your account, who would I pick and why? I'd say it depends on what you're trying to do, but also Yelan would probably always be one of those 2. I'd say if you're trying to just get 2 incredibly strong, versatile teams that can kind of just go through anything, getting Yelan on one side and Child on the other would probably be what I would recommend. But if you don't care as much about having like a speedrunning capable team and you'd rather have a Hydro unit that can be played in a bunch of different teams and enable a bunch of different archetypes, then instead of Child, I would get either Kokomi or Ayato. Personally, with how I enjoy the game, if I had to choose 2 5-star Hydro units and I couldn't use any of the others, it would probably be Yelan and Ayato. Those would probably be the 2 that I would go for. Mainly because I just like playing a lot of different teams, and I think that Ayato is somewhat satisfying to play, and I don't really need a healer unless I do a lot of self-damage, but now we have Yao Yao in the teams that do self-damage that can mitigate that, so you don't really need a healer on your Hydro slot anymore. Also, TF Ayato's 20. But yeah. The Vape team's taking a bit of a backseat in favor of other teams now after Dendro, is Yelan's worst Hydro app at C0 compared to Xingqiu no longer as big of an issue for her as it was before Dendro. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. But let's talk about the Yelan versus Xingqiu comparison just in general first. So the first thing, Yelan scales with HP, Xingqiu scales with attack. Yelan's numbers without any external buffs generally lead to slightly higher damage output. However, the abundance of external attack buffs like Noblesse, like Tenacity, if you play Pyro Resonance, although now you have Hydro Resonance that can give an HP external buff, means that if you have external buff, Xingqiu would often do more damage than she does. Which means that when it comes to just their damage, I'd say that they're basically balanced to be around the same, with Yelan having access to less external buffs, but being slightly higher at a baseline to compensate. That's for like their personal damage only. But Yelan has also a passive that gives you damage, which is insane, right? Well, she has to pay a pretty high price for it compared to Xingqiu, which is a combination of 2 things. But when it comes to at least offensive-focused utility, the main thing that she's paying for it is her lower Hydro application. Her burst hits 3 times per wave, and it has almost normal ICD, which means that since you hit 3 times per wave, that's 1 Hydro application per wave. I say almost because technically the time rule for her is 2 seconds, unlike the 2.5 seconds that it is on other characters, which means that every once in a while, you are actually going to get 2 Hydro applications in a burst, because the time between when her first and her second and third throws hit the enemy is like a few frames, and it can actually be enough if your time rule expires in between those to get you 2 Hydrops in one wave. However, it is incredibly unreliable and is going to happen like once every 4 bursts. Like on one of your like 12, 13 waves, 1 burst out of 4 bursts, right? Like it's very, very unreliable. You can't rely on it for anything basically, but it's just a thing that can happen, which can be an upside. But as a general rule, her burst is 1 Hydro application per hit. Xingqiu, on the other hand, has the same baseline 1 application per hit because it's 3 and 2 hits alternatively, but because of time rule, it's always at least 1. However, if you have C6, every third attack is 5 swords, which because of hit rule will apply 2 units of Hydro. On top of that, Xingqiu has rain swords that orbit around him, which also apply Hydro about once every like, what, 2.5 seconds-ish? 2 seconds? I don't know. Point being, Xingqiu applies Hydro a lot faster than Yelan. At C6, it's even more. On top of that, Xingqiu's burst lasts longer than Yelan, which means that if you need Hydro application over an extended period of time, Xingqiu will be a lot better at it, right? Abilities like Xingqiu that last, well, with C2, it lasts 18 seconds, right? Because it's 15 baseline, but C2 adds 3 seconds. 18 seconds is like almost all of your rotation, which means that you can use it at the very, very beginning of your rotation, and you're basically not really gonna lose any uptime. 15 seconds, which is what Xingqiu has at C0, but at C2 it gets better. That's a 3 seconds that you're missing, and most of the time, that 3 seconds is going to mean that you can't use Yelan at the beginning of your rotation, otherwise it's gonna run out before you want it to, which means that you have to start with something else. Those are the main things that Yelan pays in exchange for this damage buff. The damage buff is not good enough to make up for what she loses compared to Xingqiu, which is why I would say that Xingqiu is overall a better unit, and a much better unit. On top of that, Xingqiu also has an incredibly high amount of defensive utility that people very often underestimate. It's 29% as a baseline, but he also gets an additional 20% of his Hydro damage, and because you always go Hydro Goblet, he has an Ascension passive that gives him 20% Hydro bonus. Then that's always what? It's 20% of 66, so it's like 13.2, like 13.32, that's 66.6, which means that his damage reduction is actually 42.32, about 42% damage reduction, which almost halves the damage you take. On top of that, when his swords are broken or when they expire, they also heal a little bit, and that's basically enough to make it so that you generally take less than half the damage you would usually take when Xingqiu stuff is active. And because its uptime is so good, right, with that 18 seconds at C2, it's basically always active. Which is an additional thing on top of the fact that even looking at offensively, the Hydro application will generally be enough to have Xingqiu come out on top. He also has that incredibly high amount of defensive utility that's just the cherry on top. However, I did say at the very beginning of the video that I consider Xingqiu to be the best unit in the game. So not being as good as Xingqiu is something that Yelan has in common with literally every other unit, including every good unit. Not being as good as Xingqiu is not an indication that Yelan is a bad unit, and far from it. And the question here, which is, with Vape units taking a bit of a backseat in favor of a lot of Dendro teams, how much does her lower Hydro application matter? The answer to that is it still does, but now it's not just a question of do you have enough Hydro or do you not have enough Hydro? It's actually a question of how much Hydro do you have? The actual application speed matters. And so in Dendro teams, instead of it just being I have enough Hydro or I don't have enough Hydro, her a bit less Hydro is just a bit less reactions. And she's not gonna get overtaken by the Dendro units like she would get overtaken by Hu Tao, because Hydro's often not actually the aura in a lot of the reaction teams. You actually would rather it being the trigger, although it's not the end of the world if you play Electro Charge. I understand that this is an Ask Yelan, or Ask Zajef Yelan, Yelan Ask Zajef. I don't want to spend all of it just saying, yeah, she's not as good as Xingqiu. She really is. So I'll try to put the Xingqiu comparisons in the backseat for now. Just remember that just because she's not as good as Xingqiu doesn't mean she's bad, and that there are actually definitely teams where she can be a replacement for Xingqiu. And if you don't care about the defensive utility, there are a few teams where she can also be an upgrade. And a few of those actually are some Dendro teams. So in a lot of the Dendro teams, slower Hydro application just means a bit less seeds, but it also means that you have your Dendro aura staying on enemies more. If you're in a Hyperbloom team, then you're gonna trigger Quicken, and the Quicken aura can be used as the aura for a Bloom reaction, which means that with a lot of Hydro, you can end up losing your Quicken aura faster. Whereas with slower Hydro, you'd keep your Quicken aura a little bit more, right? That's what people call Quick Bloom. Quick Bloom isn't necessarily an advantage, right? Because at the end of the day, more Quicken means less blooms, hence less Hyper Blooms. So you're trading one thing for another, you're not upgrading, but it does mean that you're not really downgrading that much anymore. It does mean that the slower Hydro is not as big of an issue as it once was. So in those teams, yeah, I'd say that it's not as big of an issue. For sure. However, that does not mean that you want less Hydro, and that's a misconception that I've seen floating around a little bit. I've even seen some people think that activating this constellation was a downside in those Quick Bloom teams. It's not. It is not. It's an upside. If you have the C2 and you don't activate it, unless you just don't want to activate your constellations, because like, I don't know, you're fucking, like your Ziox and your loser IRL, true. There's no reason not to activate it. It's not a downside. It does mean that you lose a bit of Quicken uptime, but the Hyperblooms you're gaining in exchange justify it. It's worth it. You should activate it if you have it. Speaking of whom, how do they measure up against each other in their archetypes? When is she better? When is she worse? And how big is the difference between the two realistically? So The difference between the two, if you don't take into account the defensive utility at all, will generally vary between them being about as good as each other to Xingqiu being quite a bit better, because some of the teams like just can't function without that level of hydro application, or at least can't function very well. Like they'll still clear Abyss with enough investment, but like it's going to be a pretty big downgrade. The biggest thing is that that's without taking into account the defensive utility, and Xingqiu's defensive utility is fucking broken. Having that interruption resistance plus that 42% damage reduction plus that little bit of healing, a lot of people don't realize how much tankier that makes you. It's a lot. My Yelan has 35k HP, my Xingqiu has 19k, but my Xingqiu's tankier. My Xingqiu can take way more damage because that damage reduction makes his effective HP almost twice as high. And then on top of that, he heals a little bit. Not much, right? Like the healing isn't that much. But like, a lot of people think that having 35k HP on Yelan makes you incredibly tanky. And it does make you pretty tanky, but Xingqiu makes you that tanky on every single member of your team. Because every single member of your team gets that, like, additional fuck ton of damage reduction and healing. Only one of them gets the healing, but they all get the damage reduction. Also, yeah, her base defense is pretty fucking low, isn't it? Yeah, Jesus. I never noticed how low it was. Jesus, that's low. Anyways, stop asking me questions comparing her to Xingqiu if you don't want me to answer them. Okay? It's fine. We can talk about a few of the archetypes. Generally, in hyperloom teams, Xingqiu is a bit better as a baseline, but not that much better, again, without the defensive utility. In a lot of the vape teams, Xingqiu is quite a bit better because a lot of the vape teams use Bennett, and even the ones that don't generally do like having a lot of hydro application. It just makes it a lot easier. Although, there are some good vape teams where you can use both of them together, and that's obviously very good. In taser teams, often Xingqiu is also a bit better because a lot of them don't on-field unit that deals damage through talents. Taser teams are often either pretty quick swampy or driven by a unit like Sucrose. Maybe use someone like Kokomi who does a lot of their damage through the clam set that doesn't benefit from damage percent. But yeah, in like Burgeon teams, Xingqiu is a lot better because having the slower Hydro up is actually an incredibly big deal because it means you can't really get blooms at all. I guess I'll use Xingqiu in the team just so I can battery her. Alright, so you get some bloom at the beginning, but after that, oh, that's one virgin. Oh, another virgin. Let's go. That's two. Can we get a third? No, we can't. We got two. After our burst at the very, very beginning, we got two virgins in our rotation. Because burning, unless you do something to like reduce the aura of it, is just enough aura to completely block your bloom. So you will only trigger vaporize. Right, with the same thing, but Xingqiu instead. You can see just how many more seeds we're generating, right? Like, it's not just the, wow, I don't know, 1.5 more pyro application that Xingqiu usually has. It's like, actually like 5 times more seeds. Because that, like, burning blocking stuff screws Yelan over really, really badly because he doesn't have a way to apply Hydro 2 times in quick succession. So you're gonna put out the burning, and then you're gonna hit with Pyro again, so you have to put out the burning again. And then you're gonna hit with Pyro again, and then you have to put out the burning again. It's fine with Thoma instead, because his Pyro application is a lot slower, but you still experience a little bit of the issue. Also, Burgeon is generally a team that does better in AoE than single target, and she has very, very bad AoE Hydro application. Xingqiu at least has the orbitals and the E itself being, if you use a Masak Sword, actually a pretty large amount of Hydro up. And if you don't use a Masak Sword, it's still a decent amount. But then this is a place where a lot of the other Hydro units, if you can manage to slot them in, can actually be pretty good. Anyways, in Nilou Bloom teams, honestly, I don't like either of them. I know that a lot of people use either one or sometimes even both of them in Nilou teams because they're very good single target units, which is a good way to mitigate Nilou teams' weakness, which is generally the single target floors. But personally, instead of mitigating your Nilou team's single target weakness, why not just add in a cookie, play Hyperbloom when you're in single target, and then just play a more AoE focused Nilou team when you're in AoE. I get the idea, but generally I'd rather just go for an AoE Hydro option over one of them. Or sometimes just a second Dendro option as well. Are there any other archetypes? I mean, in hyper teams, they're both okay. In overvape teams, electrocharge can end up whittling down your hydro aura, and if your hydro application is a little bit slow, that can actually be enough to make you lose some vapes on Yelan. It won't be too many, but you might lose a few here and there. In soup, kind of the same idea, but if you manage to swirl your hydro, then that kind of fixes it. So it generally isn't too big of an issue in soup. Oh, and freeze. I don't like Yelan in freeze. She's fine when you're in like freeze single target, but because she doesn't have reliable off-field AoE hydro application, then you're not freezing in AoE a lot of the time. Ugh. It goes against what freeze is trying to do. If you're playing 2 hydro units in freeze, then it's completely fine. But if you're playing her as a solo hydro in freeze, it can be a little bit rough. Xingqiu having his rain swords around him is actually all the hydro you need, because generally you're gonna have one main target that's like tankier than the others, and as long as you manage to keep the other targets frozen, even if you're not really hitting them, they'll generally die to your AoE damage from your cryo units and your animal units. So like the lack of AoE hydro damage is not really the problem, it's really more so just the application, and even just having a little bit around you like Xingqiu is enough to make a world of difference. Although she is obviously still very good if you end up being in a single target chamber that's freezable, but generally it's just not really what I would recommend. And I would stick to Xingqiu or another one of the 5-star hydros. But she definitely still works, right? Like, she's good enough to kind of make up for that. And even if she doesn't fit your team that well, you'll still be fine. You'll still, like, I'm sure that there are a lot of people watching this that play Yelan in freeze and that are like, what the fuck do you mean? My freeze team is fine. And it is going to be fine. And like, there's not gonna be a problem with it. It's not gonna struggle to clear. It's just somewhat suboptimal. Okay. As a unit with off-field hydro application that triggers on normals, how well does he synergize solo with the game's on-field carries compared to the likes of Fischl and Albedo? Generally better, kinda? There's not a lot of units that don't do normal attacks. Apart from a certain someone coming next patch, basically every unit does normal attacks. Like, what's a unit that doesn't do normal attacks? There's a few units whose optimal combos don't include normal attacks, but they don't have to, like, they don't lose much by adding normal attacks into it. Ito has some periods where he's not using normal attacks, that's true. But Ito also, there's not generally an incredibly good last slot in Ito teams, which means that even then, she's still fine because it's not like you've got that many better options, right? And you do still need to normal attack on Ito. It's just, you're gonna have, well, about, what, 8, 9, 10-ish charge attacks where you won't get Yelan procs. I guess Ganyu is a unit that doesn't, like, that actually does lose quite a bit by having to normal attack. So I guess that would be another one of them. Tifnari isn't on field for long enough for it to matter. And you usually don't actually lose much by weaving in normal attacks on Tifnari because after your 3Es you swap out of him anyways. So like, oh no, I had to do my 3Es a little bit shorter. Well, it doesn't really matter. Although, it would be fair to say that like, you generally don't really care that much about hydro application in a lot of Tifnari teams. But yeah, I would say that like, as a general rule, she's mostly an upgrade. Although in Dendro teams, specifically like in Quicken teams, Fischl is very good. Fischl is not that great of an option if you're on-fielding a Dendro unit in your Quicken teams, because while Quicken is an Electro-related reaction, Spread is not. Spread is a Quicken aura, which is not Electro, and that reacts with a Dendro trigger. So it isn't actually counted as an Electro reaction, which means that unless you have underlying Electro with your Quicken, which you generally don't if you on-field the Dendro unit, most of your Dendro attacks will not trigger Fischl's Ascension 4 passive, which has as a requirement to proc to trigger an Electro-related elemental reaction. And again, Spread does not count as one of those. Which means that with a unit like Alhaitham, Fischl is not necessarily the greatest, but in most of the other Quicken teams, Fischl is very, very good. And you could argue in some of in a few of the situations better than Yelan, yes. Generally, there are, like, I guess there are also some carries that, like, have very long animations and want to swap a lot that are not that great with Yelan. So you look at someone like Kutsing, for example. Kutsing doesn't work that well with Yelan, but it still works fine. Like, it's not like it works poorly, it's just not quite as insane. Are there situations when using her Breakthrough Barb is useful, and is her normal attack talent worth leveling for its damage? Okay, so no, but yes, but no. Optimal Yelan rotations do use the Breakthrough Barb. The thing is, it's such a minor damage gain for such a massive pain in the ass, where if you fuck it up a little bit, if you do it a little bit too early, you don't get the Breakthrough Barb. And if you do it a bit late, it's a damage loss. After the first rotation, it's RNG whether you get it or not, so you have to be paying close attention to her fucking thing. Which, when you have like 83 effects, you have Kazuha's Burst blocking your vision, Nahida's Burst blocking your vision, like, You can't fucking tell what color this is. You can't tell if you got it or not. So you're gonna try? Alright, you're gonna try? Oh, I didn't get it. Okay, cool. And that's gonna be a massive DPS loss. If you don't do it like well, it's also gonna cost you an exquisite throw, which is a massive damage loss. Overall, it's one of those things that, like, while technically a damage increase, it's such a marginal damage increase for such a massive, like, time investment to learn to do it really well that I don't think it's worth it. If you just really like her, you want to learn all her mechanics, go ahead, right? Like, I'm not gonna stop you, but generally I don't. As she's a unit that gets called a must pull very often, can you quickly reiterate why no 5-star is? I mean, I did that at the beginning, just like by default, because I know that a lot of people call her a must pull. Again, right, no 5-star unit ever is a must pull, and you should never feel like you're missing out just because you're not getting a unit that you don't like. She's a very good pull, and she's probably worth getting if you're a meta player who just wants to pull for strong units, but she's not a must pull, and she's gonna have a rerun eventually, so if you don't have the primos to get her now, you don't need to. When to tap E, when to hold E. Basically, what I do is I hold E until I'm through the enemy, or until I've hit all the enemies I want to hit. And if I've hit all the enemies I want to hit in short enough time that it doesn't register as a hold E, then I tap E. But it's not because I was trying to tap E, it's just because I happened to tap E because I held it for not very long. You effectively go through all the enemies you want to hit, and that's it. You can effectively think of her as not having a tap E. She has a hold E and that's it. If you're in single target, obviously you can just tap if you want, like it's fine. But one thing though, is her E very often, right, because it goes through the enemy, it puts you on the other side of the enemy and sometimes you don't want that. So very often what I do is I do this. And that works even if you tap. Artifact set overview is emblem, her general best in slot. How good are her 2Bs options compared to it? Do her constellations affect her preferred set, and can you explain TF Yelan? Okay, emblem is her general best in slot. Her 2Bs options are quite a bit worse generally, but there are some teams where she gets so much energy from you potentially having multiple Fav weapons, or maybe you're using Raiden with double Hydro, where you get so much energy that you don't actually even need the 20% ER. Because keep in mind, right, even at 120% energy recharge, it's still 30% burst damage, right? And 120% is the bare minimum you can get. Realistically, you're probably getting 1 or 2 ER rolls even on artifacts where you're not actively looking for them. So you're gonna be at like 130-ish, which is 2.5% less damage percent than 2-piece Heart of Depth, 2-piece Noblesse, which is generally what's considered to be her second best option. And you are going to be missing out on 15% damage percent on her skill, but her skill is a relatively minor portion of her overall DPS. Basically, the point is, even in the situations where 2-piece is best, Emblem is not far behind. And if you need that 20% ER, if you need to be at 120% ER, Emblem is better. Because what you get from your artifact set bonus here, you would have to get from your substats if you were to go 2-piece. So if you need 120% ER or more, Emblem is almost always better. Do her constellations affect her preferred set? I mean, what type of damage is her C6? I don't even know. It's charge attack damage. Okay. What do you use with this then? Do you use Heart of Depth? Yeah, Heart of Depth makes sense. But yeah, her constellations do affect her set bonus, but it's only her C6, right? Like the other cons, it's more ease, but not enough to really matter. More burst damage, more HP, which increases all your damage the same. A little bit more E damage, which doesn't matter that much. And then this is a lot of charge attack damage, which can make 4-piece Heart of Depth or 2-piece Heart of Depth, 2-piece Tenacity. Or if you just have really, really good Wanderer's artifacts, that should be pretty decent, but they probably have to be really good for it to be better than the other options. But yeah, so it's generally only her C6 that affects her artifact choices. Although, because her C1 does make her generate more energy in some teams, then that can also get you to the amount of energy particles needed so that you actually don't need any ER, so Emblem doesn't become, like, Emblem isn't quite as good as usual. Can you explain TF Yelan? Yeah, TF Yelan is fun, but it's not good. That's the unfortunate reality of it. It's just not good enough. Emblem, like, her skill doesn't do enough. Like, even when you add in the additional burst proc that you get when you use her E, so instead of just being the 38% max HP, it's 38 plus another 24, right? So it's like 62%. Even that, getting 1 or 2 extra skills per rotation is kind of just barely enough to make up for losing all the burst damage that you get from Emblem. So at the end of the day, Does her usual build and artifact preference change with her team, especially now with Dendro? Yeah, so like if you don't need any ER, maybe 2-piece, but otherwise, and sometimes even when you don't need much ER. 4-piece emblem, that basically stays the same no matter what her team is. Technically, you can run her on Deepwood if no one else can use Deepwood in a like hyperbloom team, but please don't. You can technically play her on 4-piece noblesse. There are going to be some teams where the 20% attack on the rest of your team translates to more damage than getting the additional 2-piece bonus from Heart of Death on her or getting the emblem stats, but generally those teams have a unit that can use noblesse better than she can, so even then you don't really do that very often. If you on-field her in a taser team, you can also sometimes, depending on what units you're using, you can sometimes get away with Thunder Soother over emblem if you have like on-field double hydro, because your ER requirements will be very low and you'll have very good uptime on Thunder Soother. ER sends and HP sends on how much ER and HP does she generally want. So I have to say this every single Ask the Jeff. There is no such thing as too much of a good stat. Because you play her with emblem, there's even no such thing as too much ER. There is more ER than you need, but getting more stats is never bad, right? It's just often you end up paying other stats to get a specific stat. The question should be, what's her substat priority and main stat priority? And when it comes to Yelan, HP is actually not that far behind crit at the beginning, meaning that you can actually go for an HP circlet, and it's not actually bad. Generally, I'm not a huge fan of HP Goblet, but if you on-field her so she gets her own damage bonus, and like you have a Kazuha on your team, and you have an Aqua that gives you a bunch of damage percent, or like a stringless, or like a, I don't know, fucking Moon's Moon or whatever, then you get so much damage percent that HP could actually be a Goblet instead. You generally don't want to go triple HP, but double HP is not completely bad, although generally more than one HP main stat is often going to be more than what would be ideal. But if your substats are good enough, then yeah, why not? But that means that if you are running an ER Sense, because you're not running Fav, HP Circlet becomes a consideration. But honestly, the main takeaway from this shouldn't be like, wow, I need to get myself an HP Goblet. The main takeaway from this is, wow, HP percent substats are insane, aren't they? And they're almost as good as crit. That's really nice. I mean, artifacts like this pretty fucking good, actually. What the fuck is this? That's insane. Sheesh! That's what I want you to take away from this. HP percent substats are very, very good for Yelan. Yeah, ER stands or HP. So ER, how much ER does she generally want? I mean, it depends on your team. General recommendation is if you need a lot of ER, you should go Fav. Because if you need a lot of ER, Fav is like as good as Aqua. Sometimes even better, because it also generates energy for the rest of your team. Which is actually part of why I'm sure that we'll have questions on it later, but which is actually part of why I think Aqua's fucking bait for her. Because while yeah, it makes her damage numbers big, she needs a lot of ER, and Fav is just so fucking broken, right? Because keep in mind, her damage doesn't scale with attack. Basically, her whole kit is just HP scaling, which means that having a low base attack on a weapon doesn't matter. And weapons are given a substat number that depends on the base attack of your weapon, which means that if I have a weapon that has a high base attack, Fading Twilight, for example, it's gonna have a relatively low substat. When you have low base attack, which for the 4 stars, PS4 sword excluded, the highest is 41 at level 1, it's gonna be double this, right? You're gonna be at 13.3. I mean, I don't have a fully leveled up one, but if I remember correctly, at max level it's like 61.6 or something? 61.3, sorry. That's a fuck ton of VR, man. That is a lot of VR. But then on top of that, you also get the Fav proc, and you're almost guaranteed to get the Fav proc, which is just so many fucking stats. So having that low base attack on Fav, which by the way, not every Fav weapon has low base attack. Some Fav weapons have high base attack. So for example, the Fav Polearm at level 90 has 565 base attack. So it has 30.6 ER, which is half. But because Yelan doesn't have real attack scaling, then the bow being low base attack and high substat is such a nice thing for her. It makes such a big difference. In any case, let's actually look through the kind of energy requirements that you're gonna have. So, the way to calculate ER requirements is, if Yelan is on field when you catch a Hydro Particle, she gains 3 energy, multiplied by her ER. She's off field while you catch a Hydro Particle, it's 1.8. If she's on field while you catch a Pyro Particle or Geo Particle or any non-Hydro Particle, you gain 1. Off field while you catch a non-Hydro Particle, it's 0.6. And if she's on field when you catch a Clear Particle, which is what you get from Favonius and what most enemies drop when you get them below certain HP thresholds, you get 2, and if you're off field, it's 1.2. You can either use Q into E or E into Q. When you use E into Q, the upside is that your particles travel to you while you're in your burst animation, which means that you don't have to wait on her to catch the particles. When you do Q into E, the upside is that when her burst is active, her E procs an additional instance of it. But the downside is, if you want to catch her particles, you're gonna have to stay on her longer than you want to. That is generally the time when, if you want to use a Breakthrough Barb, you do, right? So you do burst, E, normal attack, Breakthrough Barb, normal attack, right? But most of the time, in a lot of teams, you don't want to spend that much time on her, and that it would extend your rotation, and so you just Q, normal attack, E, normal attack, swap out. And you don't actually do the Breakthrough Barb. And if you do that, you're probably not catching your own particles. We'll start by being generous and assume that you do EQ, so you do catch your own particles. What's a team where she can't use 2E's per rotation, but you play her solo Hydro? Yoimiya? People play Yelan's solo Hydro with Yoimiya? God save my soul. Why? I mean, you'll see once we get to this number at the end. Her ER requirement without Favonius would be 271. For context, Emblem gives you 20%, Essence gives you about 51, which means that you would need 100% ER in your substats. You can't get ER as a substat on an artifact that has an ER main stat, which would mean, oh yeah, Yoimiya has particles. right, I forgot. So it's 12. My mistake. But yeah, like realistically, Zhongli's not generating particles. This is best case scenario. If we want to go more realistic, wait, sorry. What's this? My bad. I've been streaming for like 9 hours already, so I'm a little bit tired. If you want to go more realistic, Zhongli's generating at most 3. Most of the time it's 1 or 2. And Brother is Favonius Lance on Yunjin unreliable because she doesn't have any multi-hits. And this is a single target focused team. But yeah, so you need like around 95, right? Because it's 20% from Emblem, 51.8 from Ascend, so around 193. 93 ER from substats, which is 23% ER per artifact. I would not be able to meet her ER requirements if I went literally offset with a fucking defense goblet. Which is why in solo Hydro teams, her signature weapon is such a fucking bait because you just won't get your burst. This is with ER Sense, by the way. Fav by itself gives you 60, but on top of that gives you 3 clear particles, which reduce your ER requirements by like fucking almost 50 by itself in a team like this. So it's actually like over 100 effective ER that it's giving you. 100 ER is the equivalent of about 18 substats. Aqua Simulacra, 88.2% crit damage, is 13 substats, 16% HP is about 3 substats, and 20% damage percent, you can't get damage percent as a substat. It gives you the equivalent of about 21 substats worth of value, which would mean that even if you were able to somehow meet these ER requirements that are arguably fucking impossible to hit, it would be less of an increase than a refinement on a weapon. And then again, Fav also generates clear particles which help your other teammates. Which means that in those teams where you place Yelan, solo Hydro, just use Fav. Or potentially, if you want to get a 5-star weapon for her, you can use Elegy. Because Elegy does give you that ER substat, which means that it is actually possible to get to this point. But on top of giving you that ER substat, it also gives you a pretty useful buff for your team if you care about EM on your team, which a lot of teams that use Yelan do. Point being, right, the high end of ER requirements that she has is fucking unreachable without Fav. You can definitely use Sac instead, but I'd only use Sac if you need Fav on someone else and you don't have to, because otherwise it's just Fav is just better. But it's not like Sac is bad, right? Like if you don't have 2 Favs, use Sac, it's fine. However, right, this is not the only situation where you can run Yelan. So let's now take a look at the low end of her ER requirements. Let's just do the double Hydro Taser with Raiden. This time, you can actually do QE on Xingqiu, swap into Yelan, and then do QE. And then that means that you catch 5 of Xingqiu's particles instead of the 4 that you would get from your E. And then you can feed the 4 particles to someone else. You can like catch 1 more particle that you otherwise wouldn't be able to catch. But generally, I would still just do EQ into EQ, unless you try to cheat out ER requirements in other ways, but meh. Kazuha doesn't really want to be on Fav in this team, because you're playing with Raiden, so you generally would be overcapping ER a little bit if you go Fav. Same for Xingqiu and same for Yelan, actually. Which would make her baseline ER, without Raiden's burst reduction, about 70. Now, Raiden burst reduces by like a little bit over 20, it's like what, 22.5-ish? Which means that the amount of ER you need is basically an Emblem 2-piece and that's it. And in a team like this, Aqua would be a pretty big improvement, right? Main reason why I don't like Aqua is just because it's not even always best in slot on the character, which makes it a fucking scuffed ass signature weapon. But it's still a very good option in situations like these where you don't actually need the added ER from Fav. But yeah, so her ER requirements really depend on what team you're running. In general, if you play double Hydro, in a lot of the teams you won't be able to do 2Es, and some of them you will. But if you're not able to do 2Es, you're not playing with Raiden, and you're getting like an average-ish amount of particles from the rest of your team, your ER requirements are gonna hover without Fav and no Fav weapons on team, somewhere between 200-ish and 250-ish. If you put her on Fav, right, it goes down by like almost 40%, so it's closer to like 180 to 200-ish. All in all, it depends a lot. It depends too much on the team you play her in, and she's good in too many different teams to give us like actual good reference point for ER. To be fair, another thing that you can do is you can put Xingqiu on Fav and her on like a damage focused weapon, and that means that you're generally going to catch Xingqiu's Fav particles, which kind of simulates a Fav weapon on her, which makes her ER requirements pretty easy to reach even if she's not on Fav. So if you're doing Hu Tao double Hydro, around 180, one less Fav, around 200 if she doesn't catch a Fav particle. Personally, what I do is I have her on Elegy, I have 220 ER, and this is when I play her double Hydro. When I play her solo Hydro, I replace this with this, and instead I have 260 ER. It's more than what you need, but because I play her in so many different teams and I don't want to have to swap her builds all the fucking time, I'd rather have a bit more than a bit less. Okay, since it's hard to keep track of who triggers which Bloom and Nilou Bloom, is it worth to build EM on her there? Not really. Just because, like, she's not applying Hydro and AoE. So she's not getting that many blooms, even if she were to be the trigger. It's not terrible, but meh. I'm not a huge fan. How do her weapons stack against each other? Recurve versus Slingshot versus Fading Twilight versus Fav, Elegy versus Aqua, and does double Hydro make Fav less valuable for her? Okay, so, let's start with the last one. Does double Hydro make Fav less valuable for her? Fav, as long as you're not overcapping on ER, in the sense that like you're getting more ER than you actually need, is always going to be her best non-5-star option. Not even close. And even when you're overstacking on ER, it's still often her best 4-star option. Just because it also generates energy for the rest of your team. Fav is fucking broken. Play Fav. Don't use Fading Twilight. It sucks. It's not a good bow. Like I said earlier, right? She doesn't care about base attack, and Fading Twilight is a high base attack weapon, which means that so much of its power budget went into the base attack, which means that the rest of it is kind of just like not good enough to justify. So generally, just go for Slingshot. Recurve is also fine. It's not actually that far behind Slingshot. Elegy versus Aqua. Okay, Aqua is more personal damage, but if you're in a team that uses the EM, so if you're looking at a Hu Tao team, if you're looking at Hyperbloom team, most of the time Elegy is higher team damage. Elegy also, because it's an ER weapon, allows you to play her solo Hydro, even if your team doesn't generate that many particles. All in all, I said that generally I'd have Elegy as my favorite option for her, with Aqua being not too far behind and Fav being kind of interchangeable with Aqua, depending on what team you're playing, obviously. And then basically Slingshot and Recurve are quite a bit below. You also have like Moon's Moon in between that. You have Firefine Stringless that are all like fine options. But effectively, right, just, and I guess you have Sack Bow that's like not too much worse than Fav, but still worse. But generally, right, what you're looking for is a good passive and a good substat. Stringless doesn't have a good substat, but it has a very good passive. Same for Moon's Moon. Sacrificial Bow has a fine substat, but the main reason why it's such a downgrade to Fav is because Sacrificial Bow is a high base attack bow. Also, you can also play Hunter's Path, and it's generally going to be better than Slingshot and shit like that, but it's also one of those, like, might just be better off with Fav. Same for Polar Star, although with Polar Star, what you're going to notice is it has 33% crit rate, and Slingshot at max level has 31. Which means that the main difference is, like, there's basically no difference in crit rate, and the only real difference is the burst damage 12%. So enough to make it a bit better, but not much. And when you look at Skyward Harp, it's 22% crit rate. 20 crit damage is the equivalent of another 10, so it's basically just about as good as Slingshot. And same for Thundering Pulse, because the stats that it gives are attack and normal attack damage, neither of which Yelan cares about. The nicest thing about Yelan's weapon options is that Fav is so good, and Fav is the only Favonius, like Fav Bow is the only Favonius weapon that's given for free. Yeah, if you end up on-fielding your Yelan, Viridescent Hunt isn't bad, because even though it has less damage than the other options, it does give you that little like Whirlwind passive, which is never bad to have, but sometimes it doesn't matter too much. Does Elegy's EM share make her a better option over Xingqiu in Hyperbloom, as it's a reaction that isn't as particular as a Vape on the Hydro app? If you have Elegy, she can, in very like few and far between situations, be ever so slightly better in terms of output, but the loss of defensive utility doesn't really, like, is enough that I'd still recommend Xingqiu over her most of the time. Is Aqua a good weapon to pull for in general, and does Yelan need or rely upon it in any capacity? Definitely not no to the second question, but to the first question, the thing about Aqua is it's not a signature weapon. Like, cool, wow, it's Yelan's signature, but like I said earlier, okay, he had a minor increase over 5, cool, congrats. So it's like not a, in my eyes, it's not a real signature weapon, but it's just a good stat stick, right? Because it's a low base attack, high crit substat with 20% damage percent. Like, it's just a nice, like, stat stick. So it's still like a fine weapon to go for. It's just, it's not all that crazy. The Homa Elegy banner, in terms of 5-star weapons only, was better than the Homa Aqua banner for a Hu Tao Yelan team. Constellation Overview. How is her Constellation quality across the board? How much does her C1 affect her ER requirements? And how big is her C2 and C6? So, start with the second question, which is how much does her C1 affect her ER requirements? And again, right, because ER requirements are such a fluctuating thing, it's going to depend on what team you use her in. In this team, right, that's about 60% less ER. If we go back to like the Raiden team, well, it's not like you fucking need it, so it doesn't do anything. If we go to the Yoimiya team, it's another 60, but if you actually do EEQ, it's like 80 instead. Generally, it's gonna hover somewhere between 40 and 80% less ER, which is a lot of ER. However, in a lot of teams, it is actually possible to get 2 E's per rotation, which means that all that the C1 does is it gets you 1 more E on the first rotation. Because if you can already get 2 E's per rotation, this doesn't get you more E's in total because it doesn't change the cooldown. It still takes the same amount of time for each charge to recharge. But yeah, C1 is also pretty nice for overworld. The rest of her constellations, C2 is one of her big ones. C2 makes it so that every other proc of her burst applies 1 additional instance of Hydro, which adds 50% more Hydro application on her, which is pretty significant. It makes her able to keep up a lot more easily with other elemental application, and it makes her Hydro application be pretty similar to that of Xingqiu's. C3 is the burst one. It's pretty good because most of her damage is from her burst. C4, fine. It is pretty good in something like Hu Tao team where your other party members also care about the max HP. C5 is probably her worst constellation, but it's nice to front load if you vape it or something. And then C6 helps front load her damage a lot to the point where she can effectively just become a carry with this constellation. Overall, she's got some of the better constellations compared to other units, but as usual, right, it's not like she needs them to be good. She's still very good at C0. And honestly, like even if I could get it for free, I would not activate her Constellation 6. I want to play the game, you know? I don't want just press a button 5 times and then the enemies are dead. Yelan C1 or Aqua, and Yelan C2 or Aqua. Honestly, no. I wouldn't get Yelan C1 or Aqua, because Yelan C1 doesn't do that much if you use Fav, and Aqua is sometimes unplayable if you don't have C1. So it's kind of just, like, at that point, just stay at C0 and save up your primos, either for another character, or to get Yelan C1 and Aqua, or to get her C2. But obviously, right, her C1 is good for overworld, so if you were to put a gun to my head and force me to choose between one of the two, probably C1. How does her C2 work exactly? Every second proc of this will hit 1 more time, and it will apply Hydro 1 more time. That's it. Taking all Kumars, true. Wait, that is so fitting. Is it realistic to manage 2 E's per rotation with her without sac or C1? Again, right, it depends on the team. Some teams you can, some teams you can't. The main obstacle that can prevent you from doing it is that if you don't do it at the right moment in your rotation, you do it a bit like 2 or 3 seconds too late, then you'll swap back to Yelan to use her burst on the next rotation, and you'll want to EQ, and your E won't be up. And then you'll be like, oh, fuck. Because it's not just being able to get your second E in the rotation, it's getting your second E early enough into your rotation that it's back up by the time you start your next one. How well does she function as the on-fielder in hyperbloom teams instead of someone like Alhaitham or Nahida? She can be fine. The basic thing is that if you don't have Nahida or Alhaitham, you don't have an on-field Dendro unit, which means that if you want to use one of the good Electro units for hyperbloom, so either Raiden or Xingqi, and you want to do double Hydro, well, you don't have a slot for an on-fielder anymore, which means someone has to stay on-field, and generally, in a team like that, you'd want Yelan to stay on-field. That way, you can get her E off cooldown, you reduce her ER requirements. This is a team where you would on-field Yelan a bit, but I wouldn't say that you're ever, like, looking to on-field her. If you've got another unit that can on-field, you should use them. If you use something like Yao Yao, for example, Yao Yao does on-field, but only for like 5 seconds with her burst. So for the rest of the time, you can on-field Yelan. Is the Hu Tao-Thoma VV Vape setup still doable in the same way as with Xingqiu? Not really. It is if you have Yelan C2, but if you don't, her Hydro application struggles to keep up with Hu Tao by herself, let alone Hu Tao plus Thoma. So generally, it's not something I would recommend, unless you have C2 Yelan. Like, you can make it work. Technically, it's possible, but it's such a massive and like unforgiving pain in the ass that I would not recommend it. I'm not able to do it. Which should be a good option in a Hyperfridge team with Raiden and Yao Yao. What Hyperfridge does is it lets you take your Dendro and make it last longer and like make it stronger, make it be able to sustain more reactions. So like, why not use a unit like Xingqiu that actually does make use of having Dendro be able to sustain more reactions by triggering more reactions. But yeah, you can still use her in Hyperfridge. It's not gonna be bad, although I'm not so sure about your choice of units, but hey, you do you. You do you, my friend. Is she good in Raiden Hyper in lieu of someone like Sarah? She's fine. I have an extreme hatred towards Sarah, so instead of comparing to Sarah, I'll compare to Fischl. It's harder to make her benefit from the buffs that Kazuha gives Fischl and that Bennett gives because you can snapshot Oz. But in exchange, you get your Kazuha to over Vape, get a little bit more damage out of that. I mean, you get a little bit more damage on your Raiden. Overall, she's a functional replacement. I wouldn't recommend her over them though. It's kind of just like, yeah, you can kind of go for either. Is she a fine option in NaXiaonal? It's fine. I don't like it that much because just NaXiaonal in general with her, because of her lower Hydro application, is a little bit rough to make work properly, but it's not bad. Which teams can generally be considered as Yelan's best, or what would I consider as such? I mean, I've been using this team. This is what I use in Overall, it's what I use in Abyss, it's what I use everywhere. Like, this is the team I play the most nowadays, so probably this one. Is that minus 15 temperature in the tool are accurate? That is a good question. Severe weather alerts. Oh no. Minus 15 is not cold enough for that to be the severe weather alert. Was a good team for an on-field C6 Yelan, and is a hyper carry playstyle viable for her even without C6 at her best in slot? I mean, playing her as a hyper carry is kind of just like dumb, because she doesn't even gain anything by being on field other than a little bit more energy generation. But playing her as like one of the main sources of damage in a team that doesn't really have a hyper carry can be pretty good. And what would be a good team for on-field C6 Yelan? Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe Mona would be good, right? Like something like Kazuha or Venti, depending on what you're fighting. Probably Zhongli, so you've got the shield and resistance to interruption, and Petra. And then like, yeah, probably either Xingqiu or Mona, yeah, that makes sense. Because Xingqiu gives you the Hydro Res Shred and energy. Mona gives you damage percent and energy. I'd probably go Xingqiu over Mona, but I guess you could try to Vaporize instead, yeah, that's true. Do any of her teams have synergy with Candace? No, not really. I'm sorry. What are some weird and fun team comps for Yelan that you like? I mean, I like her in Hyperfridge, even though generally Xingqiu is better, like, she's still good in Hyperfridge, and more importantly, Hyperfridge is fun. I was actually playing Hyperfridge on my Taiwan account earlier with Ayaka. Yeah, so I think this is pretty cool. But honestly, like, it's not like she really does anything special. Any fun team with Hydro she can be in, basically. How much DPS does she give to Xiangling and Raiden when she gets the voice line, "Here comes the catch"? I mean, it really depends on what team you play it in, because it's right, the "Here comes the catch" buff is multiplicative. Alright, sorry, it's not multiplicative. It's additive with other damage percent buffs. But you can kind of think of it as damage percent. So it's gonna give you more when you're playing in like a team that doesn't have the biggest amount of damage percent, right? Something that doesn't have Kazuha, something that's just running no real source of damage percent external buffs is gonna make that voice line even better, you know? Okay. But yeah, so that does it. So thank you for watching the Zajef Yelan edition. Don't spend money on this shit game, true. And yeah, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, check out the Twitch channel, twitch.tv/thejudge77. And I'll see you guys around.
Here comes the catch. Busted. Game's up.